On the morning of November 5, 1983, the body of Isadore Rozeman, a kind and elderly Shreveport jeweler, was discovered behind the counter of his small shop. Shot once in the head, the safe had been tampered with. Police called it a robbery gone wrong. Within 24 hours, they had a suspect, a quiet black man named Glenn Ford. Ford had done occasional yard work for Rozeman. He had no history of violence, no criminal record to speak of. But he was poor, lived nearby, and had once pawned items at the shop. That was enough. Within days, Glenn was arrested. No fingerprints, no gun, no eyewitnesses. Still, prosecutors pursued the death penalty, and they got it. At trial, Glenn was represented by two court-appointed attorneys who had never handled a criminal case. An all-white jury took just hours to convict him. In 1984, he was sent to death row at Louisiana's Angola prison. But Glenn always maintained his innocence. He wrote letters, filed motions, pleaded for someone, anyone, to take a second look. For nearly 3 decades, no one did. Then in 2013, a tip came in. Another man had confessed. Evidence long buried began to surface. The state itself admitted there was credible evidence Glenn Ford had not committed the crime. In March 2014, he walked out of prison a free man. After 29 years, 3 months, and 5 days on death row, he was finally exonerated. But the story didn't end there. Just months after tasting freedom, Glenn received another devastating blow, a diagnosis of terminal lung cancer. He died in 2015 with less than 15 months of freedom. This isn't just a story about a wrongful conviction. It's about how the justice system can steal a life, then return it too late. About racism, power, and what happens when winning matters more than truth. Glenn Ford lost nearly everything: his time, his health, his peace. To understand how a man could be sentenced to die for a murder he didn't commit, and why Louisiana refused to compensate him even after admitting their mistake, we have to go back to the very beginning. If you're drawn to stories of justice, betrayal, and the people who reach a point of no return, make sure to subscribe to No Way Out. This is where true crime meets truth. Real cases, real consequences, and the darkest corners of human decision. Glenn Ford was born on October 29, 1949, in Shreveport, Louisiana. The youngest of several children, he grew up in a working-class family before moving to Riverside, California during his teenage years. Ford had an 11th grade education and spent most of his life in California, where he had a history of drug problems but no record of violent crime. By his early 30s, Ford had returned to his birthplace of Shreveport. The move back to Louisiana was meant to be a fresh start. He supported himself through various odd jobs, including yard work and maintenance tasks around the city. Ford was a quiet man who kept to himself, struggling with the challenges that came with limited education and few opportunities. He was never married, but his survivors include several children and grandchildren. Those who knew Ford described him as someone who worked hard for whatever little money he could earn. His children were young when he left California, and he maintained contact with them despite the distance. The work Ford found in Shreveport was typically manual labor. He would take on landscaping jobs, help with moving tasks, and perform general maintenance work for anyone willing to pay. Among his regular clients was a local business owner named Isadore Rozeman, who ran a small jewelry and watch repair shop. Ford would do yard work for Rozeman when the man needed help maintaining the property around his store. In 1983, at age 34, Ford was trying to rebuild his life in Louisiana. He lived modestly, finding work where he could and staying out of trouble. His past struggles with drugs were now behind him, and he focused on honest work to get by. The relationship with Rozeman was strictly professional. Ford would show up when called, do the work, get paid, and leave. Ford had no way of knowing that his association with Rozeman would soon destroy his life. On November 5, 1983, everything changed for Glenn Ford. What began as an ordinary day would lead to 3 decades of injustice, making Ford one of the longest-serving death row inmates in American history. 58 years old, Isadore Rozeman was found dead in his jewelry store on November 5, 1983, by Shreveport police, who had been notified by acquaintance Dr. A.R. Ibrahim that the shop appeared to be in disarray. Rozeman operated a small jewelry and watch repair business in Shreveport, Louisiana, serving local customers who needed timepieces fixed or wanted to browse his modest selection of jewelry. His family called him Uncle Prince. Rozeman was well known in the local community as a hardworking businessman who had operated his shop for many years. The store was located in a commercial area of Shreveport, and Rozeman typically worked alone, handling both sales and repairs. His expertise with watches and jewelry had earned him a loyal customer base over the years. The shop itself was small and cluttered, filled with display cases containing watches, rings, and other jewelry items. Rozeman kept a workshop area in the back where he performed his repair work. The business was not particularly profitable, but it provided him with a steady income. Like many small business owners, Rozeman worked long hours and took pride in his craftsmanship. Rozeman hired local workers occasionally for maintenance tasks around his property. This is how he came to know Glenn Ford, who would do yard work and other odd jobs when needed. On November 5, 1983, Dr. A.R. Ibrahim, an acquaintance of Rozeman, noticed something was wrong when he passed by the jewelry store. The shop appeared disheveled, which was unusual for the typically organized business owner. Concerned, Dr. Ibrahim contacted the Shreveport police to check on Rozeman's welfare. When officers arrived at the store, they discovered Rozeman's body behind the counter. Rozeman had been murdered with a single gunshot wound to the back of the head. The store showed clear signs of robbery, with jewelry missing from display cases and the cash register emptied. The brutal nature of the crime shocked the local community, as Rozeman was viewed as a peaceful, hard-working man who had never caused trouble for anyone. Investigators began processing the crime scene immediately, looking for fingerprints, shell casings, and any other physical evidence that might lead them to the perpetrator. The murder weapon was not found at the scene, and there were no eyewitnesses to the actual shooting. The lack of physical evidence would prove problematic for the investigation from the very beginning. The Shreveport Police Department treated this as a priority case, given the violent nature of the crime and its impact on the local business community. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, speaking with other business owners and residents who might have seen or heard something suspicious on November 5th. The investigation team was under pressure to solve the case quickly and bring the killer to justice. Within days of the murder, police began developing a list of potential suspects. Anyone who had recent contact with Rozeman became a person of interest, including employees, customers, and service workers like Glenn Ford. The investigation would soon focus on a group of individuals who had been in the area around the time of the murder. As already known, Ford often performed yard work for Rozeman and had seen Rozeman on the day of the murder, so when he heard police wanted to talk to him, he voluntarily went to the police station in the middle of the night to answer their questions. This cooperation would prove to be a fatal mistake, as Ford's willingness to help would be twisted against him by investigators determined to solve the case quickly. During the initial interviews, Ford was forthcoming about his activities on November 5, 1983. He told investigators that he had visited Rozeman on the day of the shooting to ask for work, but had been told there was none. Ford explained that business was slow for Rozeman, which is why no yard work was available. Ford further explained that, while he was near the Stoner Vista apartments, a man he knew only by the nickname O.B. had approached him with a request for help. The man asked Ford to take some jewelry to a pawn shop because he needed quick cash, but couldn't do it himself. Ford, thinking he was doing an innocent favor for an acquaintance, agreed to help without asking questions about where the jewelry came from or why O.B. couldn't pawn it himself. Ford cooperated fully with the investigation for months, providing detailed accounts of his movements and contacts. He voluntarily submitted to multiple interviews, believing that his honesty would help police find the real killer. Ford even provided investigators with information about other potential suspects, including his description of O.B. and other circumstances surrounding the jewelry he had pawned. The pawnshop receipts became a crucial piece of evidence in the case. Receipts later showed that the jewelry Ford pawned on OB's behalf matched items stolen from Rozeman's shop. The pawnshop owner confirmed that Ford had brought in the items on November 5, 1983, the same day as the murder. This discovery immediately made Ford a prime suspect, even though he maintained that he had simply been asked to pawn the items by someone else. Ford later identified OB as Henry Robinson, the brother of a local man named Jake Robinson. This identification would lead investigators to the Robinson brothers, who would become central figures in the case. Ford told police that Henry Robinson had approached him near the Stoner Vista apartments and asked him to pawn the jewelry, claiming he needed quick cash. Ford had agreed to help, thinking he was doing an innocent favor. The Robinson brothers were well known in Shreveport's criminal underworld, with reputations that should have made them prime suspects from the beginning. Jake and Henry Robinson were brothers with extensive criminal histories. Authorities say Jake and Henry were suspects in a number of murder cases, but their reputations as cold-blooded killers were enough to quiet potential witnesses. Their involvement in criminal activities was no secret to local law enforcement, yet they would escape justice for Rozeman's murder for decades. The Robinsons are notorious with area law enforcement, along with their brothers Henry, John, and Arthur. John and Arthur are currently serving time in Louisiana prisons. The family had a long history of violent crime that stretched back years before Rozeman's murder. Their reputation for violence made people reluctant to come forward with information about their activities. August 1, 1980, police found Robert Earl French, 29, dead. French was shot once in the back, 4 times in the head, and was still holding car keys in his left hand. Police talked to French's sister, who said the victim bought drugs from a man named Jake, but didn't pay for them. The two men argued the day before French's death, she said. Jake Robinson was interviewed, but never arrested. The Robinson brothers remained free and are suspected of killing 4 additional people after the murder of Mr. Rozeman. In 1984, Ford and 3 other men, which included the 2 Robinson brothers, were indicted for murder and conspiracy to commit armed robbery. Charges against one of the defendants were soon dismissed. Initially, the Robinson brothers became the main suspects in the investigation. Police had received information from multiple sources pointing to Jake and Henry Robinson as the likely perpetrators. Witnesses had seen the brothers in the area around the time of the murder, and they had a history of criminal activity that made them obvious suspects. However, charges against the remaining defendants, the 2 brothers named Jake and Henry Robinson, were dropped. Ford alone would stand trial for Rozeman's murder. The decision to shift focus away from the Robinson brothers and toward Ford appeared to be based more on convenience than evidence. Ford was easier to locate, more cooperative, and had the stolen property in his possession. The Robinson brothers, with their reputations as dangerous criminals, were more difficult to prosecute and intimidated potential witnesses. Police initially were unable to find any evidence of the crime at Ford's residence, but did find residue from a gunshot wound on his left hand. This discovery was significant because a local coroner testified that the fatal shot had been fired by someone who was left-handed. The presence of gunshot residue on Ford's hand would become a key piece of evidence against him, even though there were innocent explanations for how such residue could have appeared. An acquaintance of Ford's testified that he had seen Ford with a .38 pistol in his waistband on the morning of the crime, the same caliber bullet found at the crime scene. This testimony would later be called into question, but it provided additional circumstantial evidence linking Ford to the murder weapon. The witness's credibility and the circumstances of this alleged sighting would become important issues that were not properly explored during the investigation. However, the investigation had several problems from the beginning. The state's witnesses testified about the victim's time of death, but had not even examined the victim's body. The forensic pathologist's testimony about the shooter being left-handed was later described as pure junk science at its evil worst. Critical evidence was being mishandled or misinterpreted, and important leads were not being properly followed. Evidence that could have cleared Ford was either ignored or suppressed. Police reports that corroborated Ford's account of events were not shared with prosecutors or defense attorneys. Information from confidential informants who pointed to the Robinson brothers as the real killers was withheld from Ford's defense team. This suppression of exculpatory evidence violated Ford's constitutional rights and represented prosecutorial misconduct. A friend of Ford testified to the police that he had been at the nearby Stoner Vista apartments the morning of the murder. She left him at a bus stop at 11 a.m. and testified that she overheard Ford say to her boyfriend that some dude wants to sell him a gun. This testimony suggested that Ford was nowhere near Rozeman's store at the time of the murder, but it was not properly investigated or presented at trial. The timeline established by this witness could have provided Ford with an alibi, but investigators chose not to pursue this lead. Perhaps if they had, they may have known why gunpowder was found on Ford's hands. The prosecution's case against Ford was built on circumstantial evidence and the false testimony of another witness, Marvella Brown. Brown was Jake Robinson's girlfriend, which gave her intimate knowledge of the Robinson brothers' criminal activities and their involvement in Rozeman's murder. Her relationship with Jake Robinson made her a crucial witness who could have provided testimony that would have cleared Ford and convicted the real perpetrators. Initially, Brown had been cooperative with police and told investigators that Jake and Henry Robinson may have been responsible for Rozeman's murder. Her original statements to police supported Ford's account of events and pointed to the Robinson brothers as possible killers. Brown knew details about the crime that only someone with inside knowledge could have known. However, under intense pressure from investigators who were determined to build a case against Ford, Brown's story began to change dramatically. Police worked with Brown to craft new testimony that would implicate Ford instead of her boyfriend and his brother. The manipulation of Brown's testimony represented a fundamental corruption of the investigation process. Despite this physical evidence pointing to the Robinson brothers, investigators chose to focus their prosecution on Ford. The decision appeared to be strategic rather than based on evidence. Ford was more vulnerable as a defendant. He was poor, had a history of drug problems, and lacked the resources to mount an effective defense. The Robinson brothers, on the other hand, had reputations as dangerous criminals who intimidated witnesses and were difficult to prosecute. While physical evidence connected the Robinson brothers to the crime, only Ford would be prosecuted. This selective prosecution represented a conscious decision by law enforcement to pursue the easier target rather than the actual perpetrators. The lead prosecutor in the case was A.M. Marty Stroud III, a young and ambitious attorney who was determined to secure a conviction. The investigation had already gone wrong in multiple ways. Evidence was suppressed, witnesses were manipulated, and the real killers walked free while an innocent man faced murder charges. But what happened next would seal Glenn Ford's fate for the next 3 decades. If you're following this case and want to see how the justice system can fail at every level, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more true crime documentaries that expose these critical flaws. And let me know in the comments, have you ever heard of a case where everything went this wrong? Because what you're about to learn about Ford's legal representation will shock you. Ford was assigned 2 attorneys by the state due to his inability to pay for a lawyer on his own. Both were selected from an alphabetical listing of lawyers from the local bar association. The lead attorney was an oil and gas lawyer who had never tried a case, criminal or civil, before a jury. The second attorney had been out of law school for only 2 years and worked at an insurance defense firm on slip-and-fall cases. The appointment of inexperienced counsel in a capital case violated basic standards of legal representation. Ford's court-appointed defense team had almost no experience and no resources. The lawyers had never even stepped foot in the courtroom before. The attorneys assigned to defend Ford's life had no background in criminal law, let alone death penalty cases. These lawyers were completely unprepared to handle the complexities of a capital murder case where their client's life was at stake. The defense team's lack of resources severely hampered their ability to mount an effective defense. Ford's lawyers failed to hire any experts to rebut the prosecution's case because they believed they would have to pay for the experts themselves. Without expert witnesses to challenge the prosecution's forensic evidence, Ford's defense was doomed from the start. Prosecutors were able to take advantage of the defense's inexperience and use a peremptory challenge capacity to keep African Americans off the jury, resulting in an all-Caucasian jury with a Caucasian judge. The inexperienced defense attorneys failed to challenge the prosecution's systematic exclusion of black jurors. The defense team failed to investigate crucial leads that could have cleared their client. Ford was convicted and sentenced to death by the jury without a murder weapon linking him to the crime, and with evidence from confidential informants withheld. Critical evidence that could have proven Ford's innocence was not presented to the jury. The trial lasted approximately a week and a half, during which the prosecution presented its case against Ford. The case took about a week and a half. On December 5, 1984, Mr. Ford was convicted of murder. 2 months later, he was sentenced to death. The conviction came despite the lack of physical evidence linking Ford to the murder and the admission by the key witness that she had fabricated her testimony. It was the first and only death sentence Stroud won as a prosecutor. For prosecutor Marty Stroud, Ford's death sentence represented a career achievement, though he would later come to deeply regret his role in the case. The jury's decision to impose the death penalty was based on fundamentally flawed evidence and testimony. Ford was convicted and sentenced to death by the jury without a murder weapon linking him to the crime, and with evidence from confidential informants withheld. Critical evidence that could have cleared Ford was never presented to the jury. The Louisiana Supreme Court unanimously affirmed Mr. Ford's conviction and death sentence, even though it was troubled by serious questions about the adequacy of the state's evidence. Even the state's highest court had doubts about the strength of the case against Ford, yet the conviction and death sentence were upheld. Mr. Ford entered the Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola, a prison widely known for its brutal conditions. He was put in solitary confinement in an 8 by 10-foot cell. Angola Prison, also known as the Louisiana State Penitentiary, was one of the most notorious prisons in the United States, with a reputation for violence and harsh conditions. Despite being confined 23 hours a day in his 8 by 10 cell, he refused to go outside for years. For Glenn, the recreation cage was for dogs, not for men. He continued to refuse rec time even when sentenced to death, choosing to remember he was still a human being. Ford's refusal to use the recreation facilities was a way of maintaining his dignity in dehumanizing conditions. The daily reality of life on Angola's death row was designed to break the human spirit. Ford's cell was barely large enough to contain a narrow bed, a toilet, and a small writing desk. The walls were concrete, painted institutional green, with a single small window that provided limited natural light. The constant noise of the prison, shouting, clanging metal doors, and the sounds of despair created an environment of perpetual stress. Meals were delivered through a slot in the cell door 3 times a day. The food was often cold, poorly prepared, and insufficient. Ford had to eat, sleep, and spend every moment of his existence in this cramped space. Personal belongings were limited to basic necessities, a few books, and writing materials for legal correspondence. The psychological impact of such prolonged isolation was devastating. Ford watched as some inmates around him succumbed to mental illness, unable to cope with the crushing weight of solitary confinement. Others became violent or tried to harm themselves. Ford was determined not to let the system destroy his mind, even as it destroyed his body and stole his freedom. Ford formed relationships with other death row inmates who became his surrogate family. They would communicate by shouting between cells, sharing news, books, and emotional support. Many of these men were also fighting wrongful convictions, and they understood each other's struggles in ways that outsiders could not comprehend. Ford's various appeals were turned down, until 2000. In 2000, the Louisiana Supreme Court ordered a hearing on Ford's claim that the prosecution suppressed evidence that might have shown Jake and Henry Robinson to be responsible for the murder. The two were initially implicated in the crime. This was the first significant break in Ford's case, as the court acknowledged that evidence may have been withheld. 3 expert witnesses also presented evidence that undermined the state's expert trial testimony, but the trial court denied relief, and the Louisiana Supreme Court affirmed. Even when expert witnesses debunked the prosecution's forensic evidence, the courts continued to uphold Ford's conviction. Nevertheless, state courts ruled against Mr. Ford in 2009 and 2011. Despite mounting evidence of his innocence, the state courts consistently denied Ford's appeals, prolonging his unjust imprisonment. In 2012, Mr. Ford filed a petition in federal court. After exhausting his state court options, Ford's lawyers turned to the federal courts in a last attempt to prove his innocence. In 2007, the Innocence Project, a national organization dedicated to freeing wrongfully convicted prisoners, filed a brief on Mr. Ford's behalf. The organization's lawyers charged that the testimony in the case was baseless and unreliable, that Mr. Ford's lawyers were incompetent, and that the evidence against Mr. Ford was insufficient. The involvement of the Innocence Project brought national attention to Ford's case and provided him with experienced attorneys who specialized in wrongful conviction cases. However, even with their expertise, the legal system seemed determined to uphold Ford's conviction regardless of the evidence. In 2013, an unidentified informant told prosecutors that Jake Robinson admitted to shooting and killing Rozeman. This confession, coming 30 years after the murder, would finally provide the evidence needed to clear Ford and identify the real killer. By 2013, prosecutors notified the defense that a confidential informant for the Caddo Parish Sheriff's Office stated that Jake Robinson told him that he, not Mr. Ford, shot and killed Isadore Rozeman. It was not until March 11th when district prosecutors wrote to a district judge that a confidential informant had told them in late 2013 that Jake Robinson was the murderer, that Ford was exonerated. The confession provided the breakthrough that Ford's legal team had been seeking for 3 decades. In June 2012, the District Attorney's Office of Caddo Parish, where Shreveport is located, filed new documents in federal court saying new exculpatory evidence had been discovered concerning the murder of Rozeman. On March 11, 2014, Glenn Ford came home to live as a free man after being released from death row at Louisiana State Penitentiary. For over 30 years, he had told every court and every judge that he was innocent of the 1983 murder of a local jeweler. No one believed him. After 30 years on death row, 64-year-old Glenn Ford has walked out of Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola a free man after a judge voided his 1983 murder conviction based on new exculpatory evidence. Ford's release marked the end of one of the longest wrongful imprisonment cases in American history. My sons, when I left, was babies. Now they grown men with babies, he said, speaking as a free man for the first time in nearly 3 decades. Ford's words captured the devastating impact that his wrongful conviction had on his family relationships. My mind's going all kinds of directions, but it feels good, Ford, 64, told reporters, according to WAFB. I was locked up almost 30 years for something I didn't do, said Ford, who wore a denim shirt, a hat, and dark-rimmed glasses. Soon after release from prison, Ford was diagnosed with terminal metastatic carcinoma of the lung. The cancer that would ultimately kill Ford was likely exacerbated by the decades of poor conditions and stress he endured on death row. Lawyer and friend William Most told ABC News, Ford was diagnosed with stage 3 lung cancer several months after being released from the Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola. Most said that it quickly progressed to stage 4 and spread to his bones. Ford was eligible for a $313,000 settlement under Louisiana law, but a judge denied the petition for the funds, stating that he likely had some role in the initial crime, as he had been in possession of stolen goods when arrested. Despite his exoneration, the state refused to provide compensation for the decades Ford spent wrongfully imprisoned. In December 2014, Mr. Ford filed a petition under Louisiana law that allows state compensation for those who have been wrongfully convicted and imprisoned. Statutory requirements include that Mr. Ford prove his factual innocence of the crime for which he was convicted. The Attorney General's office opposed his request and maintained that despite the new exculpatory evidence, Mr. Ford was not factually innocent. Now, the state of Louisiana is trying to deny Ford $330,000 in compensation for the freedom that was wrongfully taken away from him on the basis that Ford can't prove he was factually innocent of the crime. The state's position was that Ford may not have committed murder but was still involved in the robbery. In an interview with the Shreveport Times, Stroud said the fact that he had selected an all-white jury to convict Mr. Ford, who is black, led him to question the reliability of the death penalty. A.M. Marty Stroud III, who was the lead prosecutor in Ford's 1984 trial, publicly apologized for his role in Ford's wrongful conviction. But this apology came only after Ford was denied compensation by the state and was battling terminal cancer. Stroud's decision to speak out was prompted by his outrage over Louisiana's refusal to compensate Ford for his wrongful imprisonment. After reading about Ford's compensation battle in the Shreveport Times, Stroud felt compelled to break his decades-long silence about the case that had haunted him since the 1980s. The former prosecutor wrote a lengthy, emotional letter to the editor that was published by the newspaper. In his remarkable letter, Stroud made a series of devastating admissions about his conduct during Ford's trial in 1984. In 1984, I was 33 years old. I was arrogant, judgmental, narcissistic, and very full of myself. I was not as interested in justice as I was in winning, Stroud wrote. He described how his focus on securing a conviction had blinded him to the pursuit of actual justice. Stroud acknowledged that his youth and ambition had led him to make decisions that he now recognized as fundamentally wrong. To borrow a phrase from Al Pacino in the movie And Justice for All, winning became everything, he explained. This admission revealed how prosecutorial culture could incentivize convictions over truth-seeking. The former prosecutor made specific apologies to multiple parties affected by his misconduct. I apologize to Glenn Ford for all the misery I have caused him and his family. I apologize to the family of Mr. Rozeman for giving them the false hope of some closure. I apologize to the members of the jury for not having all of the story that should have been disclosed to them. I apologize to the court for not having been more diligent in my duty to ensure that proper disclosures of any exculpatory evidence had been provided to the defense. Stroud also revealed disturbing details about his behavior during and after Ford's trial. He admitted to celebrating Ford's death sentence, writing, "After the death verdict in the Ford trial, I went out with others and celebrated with a few rounds of drinks. That's sick." This confession showed the callous attitude that had pervaded the prosecution's approach to the case. Even more troubling, Stroud admitted to mocking Ford during the penalty phase of the trial. He recalled that while arguing for the death sentence, he had ridiculed Ford for wanting to stay alive to prove his innocence, telling the jury that Ford's lack of remorse should be an affront to each of you jurors. Stroud later wrote, "How totally wrong was I?" The prosecutor acknowledged that evidence existed at the time of the trial that could have cleared Ford. "At the time this case was tried, there was evidence that would have cleared Glenn Ford," he wrote. "Had I been more inquisitive, perhaps the evidence would have come to light years ago. But I wasn't, and my inaction contributed to the miscarriage of justice in this matter." Stroud's letter also addressed the systematic problems that had led to Ford's wrongful conviction. He criticized Ford's inadequate legal representation, noting that his defense attorneys had never tried a criminal case before a jury. He acknowledged the racial bias involved in excluding all African-American jurors from Ford's trial, admitting that he had been not as sensitive to the issue of race as I am now. The former prosecutor called the forensic evidence presented at Ford's trial pure junk science at its evil worst, specifically referring to testimony about the shooter being left-handed. This admission undermined a key piece of evidence that had been used to convict Ford. In his letter, Stroud became a powerful advocate for Ford's compensation. Glenn Ford should be completely compensated to every extent possible because of the flaws of a system that effectively destroyed his life, he wrote. The audacity of the state's effort to deny Mr. Ford any compensation for the horrors he suffered in the name of Louisiana justice is appalling. Stroud's experience with Ford's case had transformed his views on capital punishment. No one should be given the ability to impose a sentence of death in any criminal proceeding, he wrote. We are simply incapable of devising a system that can fairly and impartially impose a sentence of death because we are all fallible human beings. The prosecutor concluded his letter with a profound expression of remorse. I end with the hope that Providence will have more mercy for me than I showed Glenn Ford. But I am also sobered by the realization that I certainly am not deserving of it. This statement revealed the depth of guilt and regret that Stroud carried about his role in destroying an innocent man's life. Stroud's public apology was extraordinary in the legal world, where prosecutors rarely admit to mistakes, let alone take responsibility for wrongful convictions. His letter provided a rare insider's perspective on how prosecutorial misconduct, racial bias, and the pressure to win cases could combine to produce devastating injustices. Glenn Ford, exonerated and released in March 2014 after nearly 30 years on Louisiana's death row, died of lung cancer on June 29 at the age of 65. Ford lived only 15 months as a free man before cancer claimed his life. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Subscribe for more stories that expose the cracks in our justice system. Like, share, and help keep Glenn Ford's name and the truth alive. Because sometimes the system gets it wrong, and the world needs to know.